covered, which brings me to my wonderful guests, and I thank them for joining me so late in the day. Mark Allen, who I met very briefly several years ago in Suffolk, who runs an organisation, Ed in the Clouds, which looks and has been working with schools for many years, looking at combining the technology with the people. It's not about technology, it's in technology and people and beliefs and values and bringing those together. I'm delighted that he's coming along. We sort of followed him on Twitter for quite a while, and he talks good sense. Talking of good sense, where will I go next? Roy Leighton.
Wasn't obvious.
Roy has been an associate and a good friend for so many years, and is a real practitioner when it comes to taking the technology and using it to link schools together, not only around the country, around the world, and work with them at a fundamental level to look at how technology can answer some of the world's challenges, not just COVID related, but bigger than that. So we're going to listen to some of Roy's work and how technology is linking the world and making the world smaller, and how that might, the opportunities for that have grown as a result of what's gone on. And then Mark Anderson, who is not only at ICT Evangelist, but our ICT Evangelist for Independent Thinking. Anytime there's any technological issues, anything we want to know, he is so generous with his time. And I'm delighted that he's an associate, and I think has had a very busy few weeks from when we started opening up our conversations almost on a daily basis when the schools closed around the world to what's going on now. So Mark, if we start with you, tell me how life has been like for you and the schools that you've been working with in the last couple of months.
Well, it really has been for many, many schools a baptism of fire. And something that I've been sharing with lots of schools is just to remind them that, this isn't what a good one looks like, that acronym WAGOL. What we're seeing now is not how it should be. It's not what we would want. Lots of schools have had to go right in at the deep end. Many have been on a long journey for a long time. There's a school I work with, where a friend of mine is in Abu Dhabi, for example, and they've put a lot of things in place prior to lockdown, they are reaping the rewards of the things that they did before we actually went into lockdown. And so having those things in place has been really, really beneficial to them. But even so, even when you've got a school which has got this, had this sort of pre-work and a digital strategy in place where there's been training for staff and so forth and so on, even in the best case scenarios, it's still been really, really difficult. One of the schools I work with is Dubai College, recognised by the What magazine being the International School of the Year, all the rest of it. But even working with them, they've put out some fantastic guidance as well. If you want to look for a resource about sort of research and evidence-informed use of technology under remote learning, their deputy head academic and teaching and learning, Dee Saran's produced some fantastic resources there. But it's recognising that this isn't the best case scenario. And actually, when we're talking later on in the conversation, I'm sure about the sort of the what next sort of things. But it's identifying, I think, what access you've got to the tools that are available and how you can make the best use of them. One of the things that I thought was really difficult for schools at the start of the situation we're in right now, and it was lovely to see. One of the best things about the situation we're in right now has been actually seeing the whole profession coming together, supporting, sharing. It's just a real lovely hallmark of the profession that we're so lucky and privileged to be part of. But flipping that, and people often don't think about this sort of stuff. I'm sure Roy and Mark Allen can sort of reinforce this. It's been lovely to see all the various educational technology companies actually putting their wares on the line and offering those to schools and helping them and saying, well, you can have this for free, you can have that for free, you can have that for free. But actually, whilst that's a lovely offer, what most people would advise is actually this isn't the right time to be starting anything brand new anyway. Most schools will have either a Microsoft or a Google infrastructure within their schools. And so the advice I've been sharing with the schools that I've been working with and those that have approached me, it's not about throwing a baby out of the bathwater. This isn't a time to panic. Let's look at the great things that we already have access to within the school. And then let's try and take small steps to try and make the most of that, regardless of how far along that journey you are. And so you've got people who, I work with a school in East London, for example, and they were a Google school, but they weren't using Google Classroom, they weren't using the sort of the collaborative parts of it, and they had it as the infrastructure, and most staff were reasonably confident using email, but that was about it, And so you've got a real broad, like with many things in life, a broad bell curve of experience and confidence and competence with all these different things. But it's been tough for everybody, you know, regardless of whether you've had some pre-work going on, whether you've won awards for being an awesome digital school, because, you know, it's not about technology, it's about people. And that's one of the things that I think is so important to remember with the stuff we're talking about. Is people say to me, Mark, you know, you're great with technology, but it's not about technology ever. It's about trying to think, well, it's a bit about the technology because it's about creating those conditions for success in the background to enable it to happen. But you make inroads and improvements and developments and what have you when you work with the people and you get people on board. Roy and Mark and I were tagged in a tweet, a question about the DQ on Twitter prior to us going live and what have you. And there's a real focus on there about the different aspects of things people should know about when it comes to using technology, from cyber safety to using a spreadsheet to this, that, and the other. But it's far more about bringing people with you on that journey. It's the human side of things, which is so important. And you know, we're having fantastic conversations now. Technology, we couldn't do what we're doing right now if it wasn't for the technology. This thing behind me wouldn't be there, and so forth and so on. But what's great to see is so many teachers just using technology as the vehicle to enable them to allow learning, support, emotional, mental health, well-being, check-ins take place, all that sort of thing. So it's not about making the technology the star, but it's using it to facilitate what we want to try and be able to do. And so many people have been talking, like, imagine if this had happened sort of 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when we were all using dial-up and trying to download, you know, one song on Napster and taking 5 hours to get one MP3, you know. We're in a much better position now to have access to all these amazing tools. The thing that's difficult for a lot of school leaders is that they don't have the necessary knowledge about the technology, and think that they should be, you know, really knowing all these things about technology. But again, it goes back to having those core values. I'm sure I've been talking for quite some time now, so I'm mindful that Roy and Mark need to jump in and have their sort of say. But it is so important about the people, isn't it?
So I mean, that's what's coming through loud and clear. It's the technology facilitates the stuff, but it's about the people, it's about the values, it's about the learning. It's not just about having, and this idea that there are schools that were winning awards for their tech, but actually it was all surface stuff, if you like, and then now they've had to really dig deep in order to use the tech properly. Mark Allen, and Mark, if I call you Ed, it's only because every time you've got Ed in the clouds, which is
sure, that's fine. I mean, I've got 4 kids.
It'll be fine. Mark Ed. So how's life been for your, I mean, because like I said in the introduction, your company, it's about the technology and, you know, leveraging the power of the cloud and the people and the values. How has it been for your schools? Have they been better prepared?
Well, yeah, I would say some of them, as Mark said, some of them had the resources, had the infrastructure in place to be able to carry on with what they were doing. And so this hasn't been the kind of shock that it might have been. But I don't think anybody should beat themselves up if they're not coping with technology in these conditions. This is first and foremost a health issue, not an education issue. And even though, you know, I was in a conversation recently with the American Teachers Association, and they've got a strategic plan which covers 5 years of potential disruption from COVID. So a kind of lockdown, release, spike, lockdown, release, spike model, which they've got going out 5 years before we get back to anything close to 30 kids in a classroom with a teacher. So some aspect of what we're doing now may well need to be present as part of the mix. But I don't know that many people have got that right yet. And I don't think we should beat ourselves up about it. We're learning, we're all learning. I think something that's been a surprise to me is that whole school online classroom, I was almost going to call it Zoom teaching, but as you can appreciate, I don't really use Zoom that much, isn't really very effective as a way of delivering. You're getting the same kids turning up for those lessons every time, and the ones who are hard to reach, guess what? They're even harder to reach in these conditions than they might be in a normal classroom. And so we've got some thinking to do. In Israel, for instance, they've started to move towards recommending forgetting about whole class teaching online and moving towards mentoring and single 10-minute sessions with individual kids as much more productive, and flipping the learning for the rest. You put the stuff up online. So look, this ultimately boils down to a leadership issue, because what you're trying to do is establish a culture in an organization that makes it possible for this kind of collaborative bearing of the load and sharing of the workload, and that is a long-term direction of travel. You can't expect to. I mean, I had to laugh when I saw that the government had issued 100 million quid or whatever it was. I mean, who knows whether that's true anyway, but you know, a grant for people to move to online collaborative platforms, as if you can flick a switch and just make that stuff work. It takes much more, I would say 2 years on average, for a school to really embed the culture of collaborative online working in its practice, so that it becomes, I mean, really, I get fed up talking about technology, because I don't think this is much to do with technology anymore. It's much more about, as I say, creating that culture. And I think there are bigger issues to address anyway. Yeah, of course, COVID is important, and it's been, well, if it is the biggest economic shock for 300 years, I mean, that's massive, but it isn't the only planetary level life-changing challenge that we face, and that the next generation faces. I mean, they've got a lot of mess to clear up after we're gone. And so, you know, there are all kinds of other issues, from AI and automation and robotics and the future of work, through to the spread of fake news and people gaming political systems, through to the Uberization of work, all kinds of things that mean that the world in 10 years was already going to be hugely different. And we have to ask ourselves, I think, whether the Victorian or earlier education systems that we have around the world are really fit for purpose in that modern world. So yes, it's a fantastic opportunity to take a step back, look at education systems and say, are these likely to generate the kinds of values, the kinds of whole rounded, holistic individuals that are going to be necessary to solve some of the problems we're leaving them? And so, yeah, COVID, if it's a catalyst for bigger discussions about the purpose of education and the creation of a culture where failure is possible, where there's time to experiment, all those good things, then great, let's leverage it. My worry is that people will go back afterwards to something closer to normality and say, oh yeah, that online teaching, we tried that, it didn't work. And we could even be further back than we were. I don't think so, but it is a possibility.
I mean, it's interesting, a couple of things, the idea, and I didn't know with the government however many millions they say they might throw at it. And it's this idea, and I know Mark sort of explored this right in the early days of iPads, where, okay, we've got some money, here's the technology, and we'll just give everybody iPads, or we'll give everybody whatever the buzz thing is, and sort of job done. And it's fundamental in that.
You end up with, you know, worksheets being handed out.
I can't find any news about useless.
It's my digital assistant listening in as usual.
Being bombed by the
absolutely useless to do that, because you end up, if you're not leveraging the affordances of new technology in order to do things differently, then all you're doing is more of the same. And that's missing the point completely. You end up using iPads to hand out worksheets. Well, what's the point? You know, it's an opportunity to do things differently. And I think to get back to the metacognition aspects, I mean, one thing that I think is a huge potential from the crop of modern technologies that we've got these days is a chance to increase the timeliness and focus of feedback. You know, and if we're not doing that, if we're not leveraging it in order to do a better job of giving pretty much instantaneous feedback when the kid is in a state of flow and really in that mood to learn, then you know, let's not bother. Let's go back to basics if we're not going to bother to leverage it. But anyway, I'm sure we'll get back to some of those issues later.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And the Zoom thing, I can see on Google Hangouts that we're trying to recreate the classroom situation where you've got however many kids can turn up in front of you in their little boxes, and we're trying to deliver in that sort of way. And maybe it's a stepping stone towards something else that, like you said, you know, where it's more about one-to-one and coaching, a coaching model.
Yeah, one last thing. Roy and I,
point to get us back to where we were. So go on,
yeah.
Mark. Go on.
Yeah, one last thing. Roy and I work in a number of virtual classes with kids from all over the world. And what's been fascinating is that you can drop into those classes at any time, and you're quite likely to find a wall of kids doing precisely that. They are sitting there working, reading, doing a Sudoku. You know, they might be saying nothing at all, but they've got all their classmates sitting there on the wall beside them. It's been fascinating to watch that.
Yeah. Okay. So okay, that brings us to Roy then. So Roy, tell us some. So I don't have you down as a tech guru, but I do have you down as guru of many things, which includes using the tech to try to transform the purpose and the practice of education. So just give us an example of some of the work that you're doing that involves technology before it.
Well, the technology, I associate myself with people more competent, qualified, and more attractive actually than I am. Yourself is included in that. So if I don't know stuff, it's about collaboration. I think community will save us. I've always thought community will save us. And we have this whole focus, because as you know, we work in education, we work in social change, we work in business. And Mark said, both Marks have said about the importance, and you, about the importance of being human. So my element of this is, I will train myself up in the technology to do the work I need to do so that I can forget the technology in order to come back to the essential purpose of our organization. Now, it's lovely to see the chat. There's some brilliant people on chat. I know that I'm moving with Kath Kitchen. She's brilliant. She is the head of the alternative provision for hospital schools, who's been through the program with Mark and myself. And she may want to post it. She's already yakking away on chat. But the idea of her, we introduced her to technology a few years ago. She has now introduced robots for some of her children, like mini robots, for some of her children who can't access school. And I was speaking to her this morning, and her school have been so embedded in the technology, it's just focusing and building what they're doing. But it's not the technology, it's what Kath has, what the other people that we work with have, what you have, what independent thinking have, is a desire to bring it back to us being human. My area, although it's arts and creativity, it's also applied psychology and behavioral science. And the four things that make us human is we have a human need for curiosity, to question. We have the human need to form relationships of meaning. We have the human need to learn and to change through learning. And we have the human need to get rewards, to be rewarded for what we've done and to know how we've done that. And so what we do, through whatever means, technology, creativity, theatre, or whatever, it's bringing people back to the idea that whenever we work together, we will start from unconditional positive regard. And I know you had Dave on yesterday. Dave Whittaker. The stuff that Dave does, and the stuff that so many in Howell and the other guys do, in fact, all of Undiscovered Country family do, is start from the idea of, you are the adult in the room. And this is an interesting thing that we've seen, that some of the children are now more competent than some of the teachers. And for the first time in human history, evolutionary history, the elders don't have the answers. I was also speaking to a group of teachers today from the Greenwood Academies Trust. They're having a big thing, and they were sharing their learning that they're using on Microsoft, and we use Google and Apple. All of us, the two Marks and myself, Mark 1 and Mark 2, as I like to call them, we're technologically agnostic. My concern now is we don't have unconditional positive regard, because sometimes we're trying to fight out what works in our tribe. We then have to have dialogue. We have to have dialogue. And what we're seeing now is really interesting conversations, as Mark was saying. We're seeing the children talk to each other. We're running a program where kids in Kathmandu are working with kids in Oldham about exploring the whole transformation and learning and how they're going to get back. And they're coming up with some brilliant answers and conversations. And then the third thing is feedback. Not just doing something and going on to the next bloody initiative, which tends to be the case in a lot of schools. Let's do something. And then the fourth one is, as Mark said, embedding it, or metacognition. So those four things are what we focus on, not the technology. Do you have respect for yourself and others? Can you actually have a conversation with people? Do you really want to change? And can you embed it? And the first bit of technology I saw you use over a quarter of a century ago, when you looked much younger and you didn't have a beard, was a flip chart. Do you still use a flip chart?
Oh yeah, give them the chance.
Mm-hmm.
from. And you probably still do this, same routine. And you write down the what. So what are we doing? You know, your big questions, and then the why and the how. I don't think that's changed. I don't think that's changed. We have to say, what are we doing here? Why are we doing this? Who's going to do what? And how are we going to do it? And I'll finish my little introduction to the thing. Two things I remember from you when you were in your heyday was that if it's to be, it's up to me. If it's to be, it's up to me. And it's about the individuals. Some teachers are waiting for this to blow over and go back to school in September. Your schools will not look like your schools in September. You may not even get back into your schools until January. And I think that is a harsh reality for we're seeing in some of our global schools. And the other thing is the teacher is no longer the sage on the stage. They're the guide on the side. And facilitating learning is what we need to do now, because that's where we are, but that's also what's changed.
Okay, all right. The facilitating of learning, hopefully we'll come back to that, because that brings us into conflict with some of the government, in England at least, sort of government push models of teaching where technology doesn't have its place and the teacher is centre stage and does have his or her place. We'll perhaps come back to that. I just want to take it right back to basics, and I'm going to come back to Mark 1 or Mark 2, whichever one it is, Mark Anderson. The teachers who suddenly, so we're in a position where technology is going to be here and it's going to have to be here. How have schools been working with the teachers who felt before that they could avoid technology, they don't want to go anywhere near technology, they hate the technology? How do we overcome it's more than, there might be resistance, but fear as well with teachers now?
Well, as with many things, it's about context, you know. Something that people say lovely things about some of the projects I've been involved in, both in post and in supporting schools and things. But, you know, 9 times out of 10, whilst teachers are obviously working very hard and school leaders are supporting initiatives and what have you, it's actually been the children that have really helped to drive, and Mark mentioned the culture word, and it's something which is so important with change management. But children have helped to drive the culture change that's required and necessary and possible. So student digital leaders are a key sort of tenet to the things that I share with schools, because having those children in place, often teachers won't feel confident enough to ask under normal circumstances. Teachers might not be that confident in feeling that they can get in touch with a technician or somebody for some help because they've forgotten how to, you know, mirror their iPad or whatever the thing they've forgotten how to do. It's not, they don't feel confident enough and they don't want to look silly, and by the time the technician might have come to them to actually fix that or see them, the moment's gone, and all these different things. And so having children involved in all the processes, actually, you know, as part of your sort of steering group, your strategy, you know, some teachers complain about having like a student panel, for example, on a job interview. I think is just an absolute key part of the actual process to involve your various stakeholders in that process. And equally, I think it's just as important when it comes to thinking around things, all things digital. So again, that's a fantastic way of bringing those the students on board on that journey, and they can provide loads and loads of support, because, you know, teachers have great relationships with students. They see them all the time in their lessons, in the classroom, all the rest of it. What I've seen with some schools I've been working with is they've tried to sort of replace that, not replace that, but to sort of mirror that experience, but in a digital sense, and taking on board and bringing the various activities that student digital leaders do in an online sense. So if a school, one school, for example, the teacher's been using a back channel in Teams to have conversations like, how do I do this again? to the children that are in the room, to provide that sort of online support whilst they're sort of in the thick of it, you know. There's a very, very difficult thing to sort of replicate when it comes to things happening in the online space. Going back to teaching and learning a second, some of the things Mark was mentioning, I'm very much of the mind of doing things for a reason with technology. There are so many things you can do that are bells and whistles. And just because you can do something with technology, I don't think it necessarily means that you can. And there was a question in the Q&A, and forgive me if I'm doing things the wrong way around, but I saw a question about virtual reality in the question thing, and I probably did the wrong thing by responding whilst Mark and Roy were talking. And
I did
now gone.
notice that I'm off control of technology for you three. That's fine.
But virtual reality is one of those sort of amazing technologies that's got a real propensity. Ruben Puente talks about technology when it's sufficiently advanced. No, that's somebody else. He talks about technology use is fantastic when we use it to do things that wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for the technology. And Mark alluded to that in his thing about using an iPad for doing a worksheet. There's no point in doing that. There are some simple benefits on his STAMR model. If you're typing stuff up, by all means, type it up. And that provides a few benefits. Your presentation's better, it checks your spelling, you can highlight stuff a bit better. It's not really transforming learning. And VR really does give a propensity for doing things that are absolutely amazing. But equally, it gives you the opportunity to do things which are really, really gimmicky and don't inform learning. And so it was great that Mark mentioned about the thing around giving feedback. The Education Endowment Foundation released a great report this time last year about the key things that you can do when it comes to embedding and engaging technology into your schools. And there are 4 key things in there. And the first one, which is really important, is about not bringing in technology for technology's sake. It's often something which is desperately trying to solve a problem that hasn't really been clearly identified, and so unpicks the things that you should be doing around that. But the final one, and we all know the importance of feedback and closing the feedback loop and what have you. And one of the things that so many teachers have been telling me is that actually, there's been a real sort of light bulb moment for them, has been the real powerful tools that are available across all the different ecosystems for leaving really meaningful and purposeful feedback, and doing that in ways as well which actually can connect with your students. And what's been really lovely has been lots of these ideas have actually come from the student, bringing it back to the question, have come from the students themselves. So an initiative I've seen, you'll probably all know the emojis on Apple devices. You can have memojis, which are emojis that are based on your own face. And so teachers have been making their own memoji stamps to go alongside the feedback, because they're not getting to see their students quite as often as they actually normally would do. The students will say, "We're missing you. Could you not use some memojis on your feedback?" And so teachers are leaving audio feedback and thus being more productive, giving much more detailed and accessible feedback. That's a fantastic feature of using the audio feedback for students who struggle with writing. You can be far more productive and say much more in a minute than you can actually handwrite and things. But then putting a little memoji next to it as well, so that the student can actually connect. And obviously it's not your actual face, but it's a sort of facsimile of your face. But it helps to keep those connections going. So you see a smiley face or like a head exploding or whatever else it is. And these ideas have come from conversations with the learner saying what they're missing. Can you do this for us? Can you do that for us? And I think when you've got the culture right in your school, where teachers listen to the voices of the young people that they work with, they can actually develop some fantastic, really innovative approaches that are really low tech, actually. So that whole idea of low access and high challenge, you can do some really simple things, like say recording your voice and all the rest of it too, but it can have a huge impact on maintaining those relationships with your learners, because that's one of the things that's most difficult. We've heard Roy and Mark talking about sort of socialisation and things, not being in school and not having those sort of real life connections, and the importance of the human side of things. It's just another simple way that teachers and schools and children are able to connect back with each other, backwards and forwards, without having that actual physical geography.
So just before I move back to Mark, and I want other Mark, Ed, to talk about the gap. A question coming from Maxine. Do you, and it came through while you were talking, so I'll put it to you, Mark Anderson, do you advocate going into projects with children together, developing ideas and processes together as we go, knowing that we teachers are not secure ourselves and figuring things out together? So is there a sense of, let's just get on with it and let's do it together, as opposed to I'm the teacher, therefore I need to know more, and I'll tell you, we're all in this together, so let's learn together. Do you advocate that? Is that what you're seeing?
100%. I mean, Mark Allen said it, and it's an old adage about moving away from the idea of teachers and leaders being the sage on the stage and actually being the guide on the side. It's not about the children leading on things, but they can certainly input into the activities that you're doing. And when you mentioned the iPad project that I was involved with back at Clevedon, you know, that we heavily involved not just our students but our parent body as well. We had a sort of steering group which involved all those key stakeholders, from governors to teachers to parents to the children as well. And I think it's really important that when you're thinking about these sorts of things, you involve the people who are going to end up using them. And there's so much more choice available now as well. And so, you know, I did work with one school a while ago, and you'd walk into one classroom and you'd see a teacher using Seesaw. You'd walk into another classroom and see another teacher using Shobi. Another classroom, someone using Google Classroom. They had access to Google and Microsoft in the school as well. And every classroom it seemed you went into, they were using something different. And children have enough, and the children were complaining about it. They were saying, you know, we have to remember with our academics, without having to remember the different ways our different teachers want to submit our work in. And listening to the student voice, as it's called, you know, and involving that in your decision making. It's not about letting the children make the decisions about what happens. It's using their voice to help inform what you're doing as a school leader with the things that are going to work within your school community. And Mark was alluding to all of that in his sort of bit before, so I'll zip. Yeah. And I'm sure Mark will have plenty to say about that.
No, thank you very much. There's always so much to say, and always it's useful and relevant and interesting and insightful. Mark, Alan, I just want to come to you. There's so much talk at the moment about the gap and about catching up. And one of the arguments for leveraging open English schools, not Wales and Scotland, but leveraging open English schools is because children are falling behind because they're not spending as much time home learning or much time online, and there's the poverty issue because maybe they haven't got access to the technology, or one phone between six, or all of that stuff. What is your understanding of the gap, and what should schools be doing with regard to technology and that gap, Mark?
Well, it's an intractable issue at the moment. I think it's there's plenty of evidence for underscoring the fact that the use of digital technology in particular tends to exacerbate socioeconomic differences. If you are, you know, from a family that values books and where the parents read to kids at night, and then that kid comes into school at 4 years old already loving the sound of stories, and they're well on the way, whether they read or not at that stage is largely immaterial. They've got already a culture of learning. And if you take 11-year-olds and give them identical technology, they will use it in very different ways depending on the culture of their home circumstances. I think we've got an enormous, again, I think we should relax and not beat ourselves up at this. That may not happen. I'm sure when we get back to normal, the government is going to be publishing league tables and criticising schools as if nothing's happened, and that seems a tragedy to me, because we are actually storing up all kinds of social issues. The kids that aren't going onto those online classrooms are perhaps more likely to come from difficult, chaotic home circumstances. Who knows what kind of social care issues are being exacerbated by this kind of gap in normal delivery. And you've got the feeling, quite strong feeling, I think, that you know, we're seeing that government approach towards education is basically that it's a child-minding service. And I want to go back to the question that you raised before with Mark Anderson as well, about this notion of teachers who don't find it as easy to feel comfortable. My experience of this, having worked with schools for 11 or 12 years now, is that it's always some mix of fear and embarrassment that prevents teachers from feeling comfortable. And sometimes that will get dressed up in a kind of an aggressive hatred of anything to do with technology. But usually that's because it's somebody who, you know, the internet happened and they missed it, and now everybody else knows the difference between downloading and uploading, and they don't. And they feel stupid, as Mark said. And that's where, in fact, it can be very difficult for those people to learn from an external expert or from another member of staff, but it might be easier for them to learn from an 11-year-old, you know, and using kids as a way of getting through to those difficult teachers. But in a way, I almost have more problem. If you imagine that there's a train of different carriages, and that the last carriage is full of those people who are the Luddites who hate the new technology. Those people are easy if you spend enough time and you have enough TLC to give those guys. The first carriage, the Tiggers that go rushing off, embracing new technology and going off half cock, They're more of a problem to rein them in. Fundamentally, this all boils down to being a leadership issue. The job of the leadership team is to push for change, because if you don't, you get the Henry Ford situation. You know, if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they'd have said a faster horse. And so you have to be moving things forward, because otherwise there'll be a lack of impetus. And the job of the leadership really is to introduce that change at the rate, the speed at which the organization can withstand, but no faster, because you don't want to break things in the process. And sometimes that will mean flushing out the peculiar power structures that exist in schools that prevent change from being introduced. I've seen schools where, you know, teaching assistants might have an inordinate amount of power, and they're effectively able to stop the introduction of new technologies, or where the head of a department in a secondary school might say, you know, not on my watch, that's not what my fiefdom's going to do, and they've got so much power. Ultimately, as I say, it comes back to a leadership issue, and I think that we could do a great deal of good by making sure that we're concentrating on developing better leadership skills than worrying about any particular technology. So yeah, the gap, it is real. It is going to get worse in this time of crisis. I think, you know, the money that the government might have been spending could have been perhaps more wisely used by making sure that those people have access to technology. But, you know, if you are sixth in line to use your mum's iPhone every day, it isn't going to happen. And like I've said a number of times now, let's not worry too much about how we're doing under COVID. You know, let's use it as a chance to do things better. Minette Batters, the head of the Farmers Union, is developing a strategy called Build Better, about how we do things when we go back. And as you've alluded to, you know, in a post-Brexit world in which their workforce is going to be very different, they're thinking strategically about how we might do things differently and learn from this. And I think we've got to be using this as a chance, once we settle down to something approximating normal again, let's have a think about what worked and what didn't, and try and embrace
going
it.
forward is tech and building better. Is technology one of the tools that can be used to close this gap? And we talk about the gap as if it wasn't there before, but it was, and always has been. Something will be. Is technology a way of solving it? Because there are people saying, well, if technology is one of the things, if there's a difference in what technology people have got access to, children have got access to, let's just get rid of the technology, then that becomes a leveler then. That argument is out there. So is
and you know, let's ban paper and writing, and you know, where do you go back to? The genie is out of the bottle now, and I would be happy if we never talked about technology at all, because it's part of the air that we all breathe. You know, there's not a kid in primary school who's as old as the iPhone now. They've been born in a visually stimulating world where they're used to scrolling with the world with their thumbs. As Roy alluded to earlier, they're coming into school fluent, not necessarily good users of the technology, but completely fluent in the mechanics of it. So helping them use it better, helping them leverage the technology to good end instead of the very poor uses to which technology can be put, is an important job. And that's not a reason for not doing it. You know, we have to do it, and we have to narrow that gap. We have to, you know, use positive discrimination in order to reach those hard to reach kids. But it's got to be done using technology. There isn't a business in the world that is turning its back on technology because it doesn't like it. That's just the way the world is now. And, you know, there's the old cliche, if you don't like change, you're going to like irrelevance even less.
Yeah.
Thank you, General Patton.
Roy, go on.
I think that we have to go back in terms of, what is the gap between? If we're talking about the gap between attainment from a purely academic perspective, then scrub that gap. You're not going to get that. It's going to put the children, the teachers, assistants under unrealistic pressure to come up with an outcome that isn't useful, isn't relevant, and isn't helpful. We have to answer, what have we got the gap between? And yes, the technology can sort it. I think the gap at the moment that we're seeing moving forward, and I've had several conversations, and I'm sure the two Marks will chip in on this, the gap between the traditional structured, ordered level of the world, and a more complex one, which we are evolving to. Now, we have systems, models for this that you and I, Ian, and the Marks know that we are seeking to work our level up the level of complexity. But let's not worry about what that looks like. But the key thing is, we are now seeing kids who are not necessarily engaging in terms of the outcomes particularly well in a traditional setting, becoming the experts and really being excited by learning, partly due to the technology, but partly due to the structure of learning, where the teacher says, here's your learning, I'm not going to give cert of you in the class. This is the learning. I'm going to be online in this time and this time. If you've got any questions, come to me. I'm going to check in with you. I'm going to look at your documents. I'm still going to be on top of you. I'm going to be over you like a rash. But it has to be more self-organizing. The kids that are really suffering, and the teachers are really suffering, are not those who don't like the technology. They're those who don't deal with change because they have been successful in a system that is no longer relevant, helpful, or useful. And in all the work that we've done, and I mean the whole of the ITL family, and particularly Mark and I over the past decade, it's the change process that's important, and having a framework for that. And so we don't work with schools unless we have access to the teachers alongside in order to support them. Over the past few weeks, Mark and I have built a website with teachers and parents in America, Canada, Nepal. Have a look at what's the website called, Mr. Allen? Resilience Now for Parents. That's been a collaborative thing with parents all over the world. We've created websites and access to resources for kids in Nepal. But that has not been that's been a technological tool, but driven by a social necessity, by people wanting to be engaged. And I think if we are going to look at Linda Tablet, she's chatting away, sorry. Linda is from Cairo, and look at 529, she did a lovely post. She talks about in Cairo, they're going to do blended learning, and they're going to have some of the kids in at some times, and broadband's a bit of an issue there. And I know that, Ian, you've instigated conversations with other educators around the world and our sort of Thursday chats. And what we're seeing now, that the problems are the same, and it comes down to lack of opportunity. Technology is an aspect of this, but this is a poverty issue. This is a poverty issue. This is a political issue. This is not an educational issue on its own.
The blended learning one is an interest. Actually, just on poverty, in a previous conversation with Dan Morrow, as a chief executive of a number of primary schools in some socio-economically challenged areas, we were just chatting about early years, and we talked about the gap. And he said, we can't talk about the gap. It's a question about poverty, not about the gap, about poverty. Poverty is a choice. Yeah. And it's a political choice, that is made in that way. Just going back to blended learning, because we had a question that was emailed to me today about blended learning. And also on the Q&A here, I'm a primary teacher. Do you feel there have to be a hybrid type learning between face-to-face and distance learning? Is blended learning in the future? Is that the way? What do we mean by blended learning?
Definitely, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. The genie can't go back in the bottle. The toothpaste can't go back in the tube. My wife, like I said, is an international school head, and I was asking her what's changed at her school, and she says everything. We're not going to go back to how it was, but there'll be some of the stuff that was there before, and not because there's still going to be COVID here for the next 5 years, just because we're now in a better place. Sorry, go on, Mark Allen. Go on, Mark Allen.
Yeah, my hope is that this will act as a catalyst for moving away from high stakes testing and content knowledge. I mean, I know that opens a whole can of worms, and Twitter will go crazy if we start getting into a content versus skills debate, but I see this as an opportunity. I mean, look, honestly, before COVID came along, I really did mean to start getting good at making sourdough, right? And COVID has finally given me the opportunity to do that. Plus I'm doing DIY, and I'm enjoying the smell of the flowers, and I'm kind of engaging with the world in a more practical way than I've had an opportunity to do for years. And it's been great. And I don't know if you've seen any of the Grace and Perry TV programs, his art club on TV. This has been an explosion of people's creativity. And it feels to me like this really is something that we could take back into school. If there was a chance to move towards more longitudinal work, project-based work, maker spaces and tinkering and those kinds of things alongside academic. I'm not interested in getting into a one is better than the other approach. We need to do it all. But there is a chance to perhaps move away from, you know, the reason we have the education systems we do is because the factories needed people who could count bobbins and add up a row of numbers and write in beautiful copper plate. Well, you know, guess what? The world isn't like that anymore. We need different skills. We need people who can work collaboratively, people who can influence networks, people who can be transmedia literate, you know, literate in a whole range of different ways. That your ability to convince people on YouTube is at least as important as your ability to write a good letter now.
Yes.
So there's a whole range of, I would think, ways of being in the modern world, which school is not addressing particularly well. Now, I don't necessarily have high hopes that we're going to get to that anytime soon, but that has to be the direction of travel, surely. That the job of an education system is to produce young people who are capable of surviving and thriving in the world they're going to face for the next 75 years of work, you know, if they're lucky, if we've got that long. So how well are education systems doing? Well, judging by, you know, the level of English I see on Facebook, judging by how completely foxed people are by basic number techniques, not very well. You know, you'd say if education was a factory, we're kind of declaring 90% of our product to be reject. That's not a great system. So I would hope that this is an opportunity to look at it and say, can we do better in preparing young people for life?
Yeah.
Am I optimistic that's going to happen? Not at all, because there is this tension between the measurability that politicians love so much and the reason that most people get into education in the first place, this desire to do good, to improve the life chances of young people. And there's a tension there that has to be resolved at some point. And they're doing that better in some parts of the world than others, obviously.
Yeah, we've got an online conversation tomorrow. It's a closed one. It's not a public one, but it will go public at some point, called School Differently. And it's trying to say what can we do to that would make you be more optimistic about the opportunities. And maybe here's the school system the way that it is, and some people do very well in it. But around it, there's a framework that maybe there's a bit more flexibility to allow everybody's talents to come through and everybody's challenges to be addressed. That's what we're looking at. Mark, there's a question that's come through, which I think I want to hit to you because it's a platform question. So just a quick answer. We've got 4 minutes to go. What specific have you seen for EYFS, early years, Key Stage 1, in terms of an online platform that develops their independence and social learning as well? What practices out there that you know of?
So I always sort of come back with these sort of questions to what is it you're trying to achieve through it first, and then at that point then go and try and find a product that's out there that facilitates those sort of things, but with no no ties or links for this recommendation at all from me, no ties to the company at all. What I'm seeing being used, oodles and oodles that facilitates all these sort of things, and connections to parents, so parents can get involved in these sort of conversations as well. Massively so, not just in the UK, but all over the world, is a tool called Seesaw. Which is superb in many different ways. It may not work for your school because there are some sort of technological things that you need to actually make it work. So it only works on certain devices, for example. But again, it depends on parent confidence and ability, the support that the students can get, how well the parents can be at home supporting them through that. You know, you can do all these things that they're being asked of through things like Google Classroom, through Microsoft Teams, all these sort of things. It depends on where you are in your journey, really. But as a starter for 10, I'd have a good old look at Seesaw.
Seesaw, brilliant. Okay, thank you for that. Roy, I'm going to give you 1.5 minutes to answer this one. Given the work that you're doing, and we talked about linking Oldham and Nepal and some of your work around sustainable development goals and around poverty and your global work, are you feeling more confident that schools using technology and linking up will help address some of the bigger challenges, as Mark Allen was talking about, that we're going to face. This current pandemic is quite a small challenge compared to some of the bigger challenges that are there and that we've been talking about for quite a while. Do you feel that that technology and schools are in a position now where they can do something about the bigger challenges?
Definitely. I mean, our experience, all of our experience is are seeing the level of conversation amongst our children and young people at a very high level. So potentially, yes. But I would also like to finish on a pessimistic note, unusually. We've seen this movie before. In the history of evolution, if you go back, we've seen the point where society's got to a point of real transformation. And have a look at Major John Gloob's work on the collapse of empires. And he said there always comes a point in the stage in any culture whereby we have the potential to really excel. And he looks about the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. And he says, but when we get to the point of real innovation, and we don't use that innovation to go to the next stage, which is community, it will explode in on itself and collapse. And we're at a stage of collapse potentially, because he said the final stage of collapse in any society is when the politicians are replaced by the celebrities. The gladiators took over the role of the Senate. And I think coming back to the key point that has been made, this is a political and economic issue. It's not, the technology can solve it. The brilliant teachers who are working so hard can solve it, but we cannot solve it if we have a political and economic system that isn't fit for purpose.
Right. Okay, thank you. That's been, as somebody just said on the chat, that's been a brilliant conversation. Thank you, all the attendees, for being there, for participating. Thank you, Nina, in the background, moderating everything. Thank you, Roy, as ever. Keep safe in your log cabin there at home. Mark Allen, it's great to sort of connect with you again. I used to know Seth very well, so as soon as I get the chance to come back, I'll come and buy you a pint in a nice Suffolk pub somewhere. That's
on. Yeah.
And Mark, thank you ever so much for all the time and generosity. We've had lots of conversations in the last little while. I know how much you have really supported me and schools around the world with your technological understandings at a time where things are really changing. And let's hope that we can be optimistic and change things for the better. And that so much of that is down to us as teachers. So on that note, I'm going to lie down. Thank you very much. Stay safe and catch up with you very soon, everyone.